It's time for today's AM Minnesota program. My guest today is David Kee, who's a director of research for Minnesota Soybean. Now, Dave, one of the reasons I wanted to get you on AM Minnesota is we had a discussion, did a quick little interview at the Minnesota Ag Expo, but there were so many more things to talk about, so you were on my to-do list to get on the air for a half hour talking about all of the things that the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, Minnesota soybean growers are doing. First, Dave, how long have you been with the Minnesota Soybean now? Was it a couple years?
A couple years. I started in November of 2015.
And you came from, where was it? West somewhere, didn't you?
I was at Renville in Minnesota, Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar Co-op, and prior to that I was at a little university down in Louisiana, and then worked for the Extension Service in Texas, and I was an industrial agronomist down in Texas, so I've kind of bounced around a little bit.
And how did you end up way up here in the Northland? When you moved up here, you knew it got cold in the winter and sometimes spring didn't want to come, right? You knew that coming in?
Well, now, Jerry, you open yourself. Here's a typical response. I hung a right.
A big one.
A big right. The opportunity was here, and it was an exciting opportunity, so I chose to explore it.
Once you got to know farmers up here in Minnesota involved with Minnesota Soybean, it became really fun, didn't it? Because they are just very progressive and leaders. And we always like to say here in Minnesota, when it comes to the commodity groups, it always seems like our state leaders turn into national leaders.
It's a good group of farmers. They listen well, and then they think hard, and they come up with some good ideas.
And boy, when you look at production issues, there's been a lot of things to look at these last few years.
Well, there's no Chinese proverb or curse of may you have an interesting life. And life is really interesting in Minnesota.
If it's not the weather, it's other issues we have to deal with. And I know, David, we have to take a break for the markets here in about 2.5 minutes. So maybe in that time, let's explain how you do your job, the director of research, how it comes about that the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council decides to fund a research project. Why don't you explain how that process works?
Well, the process starts in the middle of summer when we start putting together our request for proposals. We visit with farmers, or our action team gets together and talk over about what our problems are, and we sculpt a request for proposals, which details those areas that we are most interested in. Then we release that proposal not only to researchers in Minnesota, but researchers across this northern Great Plains area. Anybody who's got we want to talk to anybody who's got a good idea. We'll even talk to people who's got a bad idea if it turns interesting. But what we're trying to do is find the best ideas and projects for our Minnesota guys to solve their production problems. We then release our request for proposal. We have proposals come in. I go through the process with the proposals, make sure they're in the right format, review the proposals, get back with the PIs and say, all right, is this what you're trying to say? And go over communication issues and things like that. Then the team reviews all those proposals. They'll go through a process of what I call a cull, keep, and a question. This is a proposal that's not suited for us, so we cull it. Here's one that's exactly what we need. And all the team members agree on it. We accept that one, and it's now put into the keep project. Then there's the ones that we've got questions on. The ones we've got questions on, we bring into Mankato or to the university for face-to-face interview, face-to-face conversation about it. After that's completed, the farmer team then decides what proposals to fund and what proposals not to fund, and how much we're willing to fund a proposal for. That's all up for debate. After that, then we release those back to the PIs, tell them those sorry, congratulations, but, and then those proposals are further reviewed by their people like Sponsored Projects Administration at the universities, other people to make sure it fits. They go through that process, then it's finalized and goes before the full board for review and approval. And this year they approved 28 projects for production research, not for the other communication and other projects, but just for production research.
And really the basic premise is what production issues are Minnesota soybean growers dealing with here in Minnesota, and how can we help address that issue?
Yes, sir.
Pretty simple. Well, Dave, we have to take a quick break for the market. Stand by, and then we'll continue with today's AM Minnesota program.
Sounds great.
The market update is being sponsored by the KDHL Agro Boosters. They include Northern Buildings for quality post-frame construction. Check them out at their website, northernbuildings.com. The market update on KDHL was sponsored by the KDHL Agri Boosters. They include Werner Farm Seed at Dundas for quality seed at reasonable prices. Give Paul or Gene a call at Werner Farm Seed at Dundas, 507-645-7995. My guest in the program today is David Kee, who's Director of Research for Minnesota Soybean. Dave, just before the market break, you kind of outlined the process of how a research project gets funded by Minnesota Soybean. And boy, it sounds like we've got this pretty well refined. I'd get the impression that maybe you guys have been doing it for a while.
Since 1974, we've got the process down, and we're continually reviewing the process. We're starting a little adaptation to the process this year, where we're going out and having regional meetings with smaller groups of farmers. Then we will have a state level meeting somewhere in central Minnesota and bring in researchers, and we'll talk about the relevant issues. What are the low-hanging fruit? What's stuff that we would like to look at, but it's probably beyond our technology? And then aim for the moon to hit the gate.
I like the idea of talking to soybean farmers around the state, too, because this is a big state, and the issues that soybean growers are dealing with in south central Minnesota might be a little different than west central Minnesota or up in the Red River Valley, because we grow soybeans from the north to the south here in Minnesota.
We go east to west and north to south and southeast to northwest and here and there and yon. Well, 18% of our irrigated acres is dedicated to soybeans. So even under the sandier soils, under irrigation, we're still got soybeans there. We impact a big area of Minnesota. And you're exactly right, Jerry. What's a problem in the southeast corner is not always relevant to the northwest corner, and vice versa. But at the same time, as you go from east to west, IDC starts to be a problem, and that's iron deficient chlorosis. Be a problem everywhere. And we're starting to see soybean cyst nematodes pop up in Kitson County. So some problems are universal, some problems are site-specific. We tried to address our RFP to cover both those issues. What are the relevant issues for the northwest side, the southeast side, the southwest side, the south central, the north central, irrigated, and then make our judgment calls as what's the priority.
Well, another issue that comes to mind that I think everybody's dealing with is weeds and resistance.
We're starting to figure out there's weeds out there resistant to everything but a hoe, and even those are popping up back again, because if you haven't hoed goosegrass in a while, or barnyard grass, then you remember how effective hoeing is.
So you get all these projects together, and then you kind of prioritize and fund them, but then you have to, the research is actually done, but then one of the most important steps then is how you get the results and that information back to soybean growers so they can utilize that information. That's where the rubber really meets the road, isn't it, David?
Yes, sir, and we're actually approaching that in a couple of different ways. One, we fund a lot of extension and technology transfer projects with the university. We also work through North Central Soybean Research Project and fund some projects that are relevant to the upper northern belt of the soybean production area. The 11 states here in the north, including Ohio, over to South and North Dakota. We publish through there. We also publish through the National Soybean Database. We do stuff here within Minnesota Soybean with our magazine and our news blogs. And I have a personal blog that I do about 3 times a month. Do several news interviews, both written and oral, like we hear, and then you and I are doing now, and television. So we're getting the message out as many different ways as possible. And we're exploring doing videos for Facebook now. And I'm an old one, so I may be technically forgetting things like Twitter and other places that I've not heard about, but our team's looking into it.
Do you sometimes fund a project or coordinate with multiple states? You kind of alluded to it, or with United Soybean Board. That happens sometimes too, doesn't it, David?
Yes, sir. We really have a 3-tier approach to research. Here in Minnesota Soybean, we deal with problems of Minnesota. The North Central Soybean Research Project or program deals with our regional problems that affect all 11 North Central states. Then the USB focuses on those problems that affect all the soybean producers in the United States. And then we're all three working on not only the research aspect of it, but getting that information back out to the farmers.
Well, one of the projects that had been funded in the past that I was just fascinated with was a research on protein, because we keep hearing that our protein levels here in Minnesota, the northern Midwest, aren't as high as our competitors in South America. But you and I were talking at the Minnesota Ag Expo. It's not crude protein. They call it crude protein for a reason. It's very crude. Minnesota Soybean funded a project that showed that actually when you look at the quality of the protein, i.e. amino acids, our soybeans are every bit as good as South America, maybe even better.
We have to remember quality is like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. What's a high-quality product, a high crude protein product, which works very well for cattle, may be a low-quality product for pork. We have to look at crude protein. Crude protein is nothing more than percent nitrogen of the seed times a factor. That factor is usually 6.25. That just really gives us an estimate of total protein. Well, that's great for ruminants where the bacteria and the mycorrhizing, the various microfauna in the gut of the animal converts it into amino acids. But for a pig or a poultry, monogastrics, they need a balanced amino acid, especially essential amino acids, as a building block to their production. So they can have a high crude protein. You can increase crude protein by adding urea to a product, but it doesn't do the pig any good because they don't use urea like a cow does. So what's a high-quality product for a pig won't necessarily be a high-quality product for a cow, and sure won't be good for fish, much less human consumption. Quality needs to be changed from quality to composition. We can tell you what we got. How well it works for the different client depends upon what they're feeding and what they're using for.
And that's why it's important then that we explain that to the foreign buyers, whoever they may be, or even buyers, end users here in the United States.
Well, that's what we're starting. One of the issues that we're looking at is getting our end users to request, instead of requesting an order in crude protein, request an amino acid content, an essential amino acid content. That will force the buyers to buy the product that the client needs, not what the buyer can make money off of.
We are having an impact then, getting that message out that it's all about the quality of the protein, not just the crude protein?
We're having an impact. We're specifically getting buyers overseas to want Minnesota soybeans.
And from what I understand, a lot of soybeans here in Minnesota aren't being floated down the river on the lock and dams, but they're being loaded on unit trains and then heading out to the West Coast to be put on a ship.
Yes, sir. We just got back from a trip from the Northwest with the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council Board, where we reviewed and visited several of these operations that move our soybeans, both in bulk and in containers. Jerry, you need to go out there and take a look at it, how much work they get done in such a short period of time, and it was so many products going in and out. But we can deliver to China what China wants. We can deliver to Europe what Europe wants. We can deliver the product that they want and let them understand where our product works better and where it doesn't.
That must be mind-boggling to see all those containers stacked up how many high, or to see where a unit train comes in, 110 rail cars, I understand, hold a little over 400,000 bushels, but they can be unloaded very quickly into a ship or stacked onto a ship.
We were watching a couple of ports, and they were doing one of those trains a night. Some of them were doing 2 and 3 and 4 of those trains a night. And they tried to get the trains to come in at night so the motor vehicles, passengers cars, and trucks can come in during the day. It is amazing to watch how we get things moved.
So what are some of the other projects then that Minnesota Soybean is funding for this next year? You mentioned like 28 projects, David.
Yes, sir. We've got a wide variety of projects, everything from plant nutrition to pest control. Aphids are a big issue. Soybean cyst nematodes a big issue. We're looking at a couple of new, I use the term buck rogers, meaning they're on cutting edge. We're looking at development of a fungus that will help us fight both SDS and SCN in the soil in place rather than having our reliance on chemicals, and to make it a more sustainable solution. We're looking at rotation and the effect of crop rotation, chemical rotation, and implementation of rotation practices to beat the resistance. One thing we have to remember is resistance is a fact, not a theory. If you do the same thing the same way year after year, something will evolve around it. With resistance, it's a result of your practices and your lack of flexibility in how you utilize those practices. If we apply the same herbicide, and Roundup's a good example, where we came in, we had Roundup Ready soybeans, we've got Roundup Ready corn, we've got Roundup Ready cotton, we've got Roundup Ready this and that and the other. We used Roundup after Roundup after Roundup, and it worked great until it didn't. We have to have a break in what we do, whether it's a resistance, breeding for resistance. We now have soybean cyst nematodes that are resistant to the PI88788 gene that we use for resistance to soybean cyst nematodes. So we've got resistance to the resistance, and it's back to doing the same thing the same way year after year. Something will evolve around it. We have to take and rotate not just chemicals, but rotate practices, rotate crops, rotate genetic resistance. We've got to rotate, and we've got to think about rotating and how we're going to fight the resistance that develops when we get a little bit slack and use the same technology in the same way year after year after year.
Well, it's kind of scary. I was up at the crop fertilizer pesticide short course and listened to a presentation. It's more, I guess, in southwestern Minnesota right now, but product failures of the pyrethroids to aphids. They weren't controlling aphids anymore.
I would agree with you, except I would include the Northwest. The pyrethroid resistance in the Northwest was rampant. Bob Cook has a interesting article just released that tracks that resistance, how it happened, and it came back to over-application at lower than threshold required levels of pyrethroids, especially the generic pyrethroids, because they were inexpensive. They're effective. There were some guys that were putting out pyrethroids 3 times last year to control aphids in northwest Minnesota. 3 times makes a cheap insecticide pretty expensive.
It's even more expensive if it didn't really do the job.
Yes, sir.
And then Lord's ban, what class was that in? Because there's some talk, maybe the regulators are starting to talk like they'd like to see, or at least some groups are talking about trying to see Lord's ban too.
We had the review on Lord's ban last year. There were definitely, and there are definitely certain groups that would like to see organophosphates, and Lord's ban is an organophosphates removed from the market. If we lose Lord's ban and we can't use neonics except as a seed treatment, that leaves pyrethroids, and pyrethroids are not working all the time. So, yeah, we've got some concern with resistance. We've got to work on finding new tools, and one of those new tools is breeding resistance to the aphid, and we're funding a resistant aphid soybean breeding project that helps us stack the types of resistance to aphids within varieties suited for Minnesota.
That's where it can kind of get a little touchy, though, with Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council. That's research, education, and promotion.
Yes,
but yet now you're funding research, and we're trying to figure out how to better utilize Lord's ban, but now you have groups that want to and are going to legislatures trying to get them banned. Well, you can't really get involved in the political process. So you have to be really careful how you deal with issues like that, don't you, David? The council does?
The council does, but that's why we've got the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association. They can deal with those projects, with those problems. And we're very well connected working with MSGA to deal with those issues.
That's because I'm a member of the Minnesota Soybean Growers. I voluntarily pay in every 3 years for a 3-year membership, so that can be used in the legislature. But when we all pay into the mandatory checkoff, that's research, education, and promotion. You can fund some research, for example, that would help clarify the issue or educate people. That would be okay, but you have to be careful because you get audited too, don't you, by the USDA?
Pretty much get audited every year, and the things that we have to, the council side can educate and promote all the way. But the minute they were asked for legislation, the minute they advocate for laws, they've crossed the line. That's where the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association steps up to the plate and takes over.
Yeah, like another issue that kind of is broad and kind of gets on both sides is China and the foreign material issue. When I deliver a load of beans to the elevator, they never check because they're nice and clean. The standard for number 2 yellow soybeans was 3%, but now China's been saying they want that down to 1%.
China has said that they will not accept anything above 1%. The Chinese have a perfect right to sit down and say this is the minimum that we accept for our imports into our country. It's their country. So they're right. Now it's up to us to deliver the product. Well, guess what? We in Minnesota, going out of the northwest ports, have a cold water access and a cold delivery system to where we don't have the respiration loss, we don't have the disease increase that our more southerly neighbors do as they go through that hot and humid New Orleans port, then down through the Panama Canal and back over to China.
So this could actually maybe be an advantage for us, and even when you look at South America then.
Yes, sir, it can be. And we're allowed to talk about that day in and day out, because we're just talking about the quality of our beans and why they remain high quality.
I mean, I see other farmers hauling beans into the elevator. You don't see weed seeds in there. You see very little stems or pods or anything like that.
Yes, sir. We've got some really clean beans here, and we have some problematic fields. We have to admit that. There are some places where we've got water hemp out the wazoo, and it's hard to get a clean load out of that. But we've got some fields that are perfectly clean, and we do a good job keeping them separated. And now they're in that northwest port, we can keep them separated from the problematic soybeans down in the southern United States, where they are having terrific problems with palmer amaranth and other resistant weeds.
And another issue with China is the whole trade issue. What was it I read over the weekend? That China buys 25% of the entire world soybean production. China's a huge appetite for soybeans.
Soybeans are in an interesting scenario right now. We have this incredibly high supply, but we have an incredibly high demand. That means any jiggle on the demand side or the supply side, we will see a corresponding response in price. If we see that we're having drought reducing the yield potential of the Argentine soybeans, we see our bean prices drift right back up. If we see anybody saying, well, we may not need as many soybeans this year, we see that price drift right back down. That's what's kind of scary, but we just have to remember this is a very dynamic market. The demand is out there. So if there's somebody that says we won't take our beans, well, there's somebody else who will.
Because the world has an appetite for soybeans.
The world has an appetite for soybeans.
I have to tell you this story, David. I remember my grandpa telling me that back in the day he first planted soybeans. It was a forage crop, high protein, fed it like hay to cattle. There was no market for soybeans at the elevator. Look at how far we've come.
According to my reading, the first market for soybeans was in the Michigan area, and Henry Ford was using the compressed mill to make steering wheels with.
Really? I hadn't heard that.
And then after that, we figured out that they could feed them to cattle and milk production goes up. And then since then, we have discovered more and more uses for soybeans. We're now expanding into renewable fuels. We're doing all sorts of chemicals, water paints, oils. Soybeans is a miraculous plant that is forever interesting.
I read once, David, that anything that you can make from petroleum, you can make from soybeans or soybean oil.
I've heard that too. I'm not enough of a chemist to be able to debate that. I'll just sit down and say that there's a lot of things we can do with soybeans.
I even read that they're now making rubber, Firestone is, for the lugs and tires because when it got cold, they were more pliable and gave better traction.
I've heard that too. I know we've got another product here in Minnesota called Replay, that if you get in the Hutchinson area, you can see where they've repaired several of their roads using this product, and it's a soybean oil-based product that extends the life of the road, and adding another year to 18 months or even longer to the repair time, to the time needed between repairs. You don't think about that much, but if you can keep from spending $50 million from every 4 years to every 5 years,
that's huge.
That's huge for a lot of cities.
And we continue to figure out more ways to use soybeans. It really is truly an amazing plant.
It's an amazing plant, and then when we find a need, we can go in there and breed some differences, find genetic differences, and breed toward that product. So we're looking for different, it's like the high oleic oil product. We're looking at both non-GMO and genetically modified versions of that. We're looking at different mills that fit different markets, stuff for trout in particular. And it's something to feed these high-value fish a plant protein so they increase their gain to meet that demand, Well, they've got to, if they eat more soybeans, that's just one more market for our beans.
For our beans. Well, we've got the news coming up here, Dave. Always enjoy visiting with you. We'll talk again soon.
Take care, Jerry. Enjoyed it.
David Kee, Director of Research for Minnesota Soybean. And that concludes today's AM Minnesota program.